In the opening months of the Pacific War, a new and terrifying specter appeared in the skies above Allied ships and bases. It was long, sleek, and fast, a twin-engine bomber that could strike from unprecedented ranges, delivering its deadly payload with a speed and precision that defied Allied intelligence reports. This was the Mitsubishi G4M, designated Betty by Allied forces. To the sailors on the decks of British and American warships, and to the defenders of remote island outposts, the Betty was not just an aircraft. It was the harbinger of Japan's relentless offensive power, the spearhead of an empire that seemed unstoppable in its ambition and reach. Its reign over the Pacific skies, though ultimately fleeting, established a legend of both awe and terror, built upon a revolutionary design philosophy that was as brilliant as it was brutal. The Betty's entrance onto the world stage was nothing short of spectacular. Just days after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 10, 1941, land-based Mitsubishi G4M bombers operating from bases in French Indochina located and sank the British Royal Navy's capital ships, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. This was a catastrophic blow to Allied naval power and morale. For the first time in history, capital ships at sea were sunk exclusively by air attack, and the Betty was the instrument of this revolution. The event sent a shockwave through military commands in London and Washington. This was no fluke. It was a demonstration of a new form of warfare. The Betty possessed the range to strike deep into enemy territory, the speed to evade many Allied fighters of the day, and the payload to deliver a knockout blow to the most powerful vessels afloat. What made this possible was a design specification that bordered on the obsessive, extreme range. The Imperial Japanese Navy, envisioning a war fought across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, demanded a land-based attack bomber that could project power over thousands of miles without reliance on distant, vulnerable island airfields. The Mitsubishi design team, led by Kiro Honjo, delivered. The G4M's airframe was engineered for lightness and aerodynamic efficiency. Its most distinctive feature, its cigar-shaped fuselage, was essentially a massive, uninterrupted fuel tank. It was this incredible range, over 3,500 nautical miles, that gave the Betty its strategic fong. It could appear where it was least expected, striking targets that Allied planners believed were safely beyond the reach of enemy air power. It was the backbone of the Japanese land-based naval air arm, the long-range fist that could punish any Allied fleet daring to approach the perimeter of Japan's newly conquered empire. In these early campaigns, the Betty was a formidable weapon. It was fast, capable of over 265 miles per hour, making it a challenging target for the slower, older Allied fighters like the Brewster Buffalo or the early model Wildcats. It was also well-armed for a bomber of its time, featuring a 20mm cannon in its tail turret and several 7.7mm machine guns in dorsal, ventral, and lateral positions, creating a formidable defensive web that demanded respect from attacking pilots. Operating in large formations, the Betty brigades seemed unstoppable. They hammered Allied positions from the Philippines to Guadalcanal, supplied distant garrisons, and conducted long-range reconnaissance missions that gave the Japanese command a critical picture of Allied naval movements. Yet, even in these early, triumphant months, a deadly paradox was embedded within the Betty's design, a flaw that Allied pilots were only beginning to glimpse. American and British fighter pilots who managed to get their guns on a Betty began to report a strange and horrifying phenomenon. The aircraft seemed to possess a terrifying fragility. When tracer rounds found their mark, particularly in the wings, the result was often not a slow stream of fuel or a controlled fire, but a catastrophic, almost instantaneous conflagration. The bomber would be engulfed in flames and plunge earthward, earning it grim nicknames like the Flying Lighter and the One-Shot Lighter among Allied air crews. At first, these reports were attributed to luck or exceptional marksmanship. The Betty's reputation was still one of a deadly, long-range predator. The idea that its vulnerability was a deliberate, calculated trade-off was not yet understood. The Allies saw a fearsome weapon, They had not yet discerned the philosophical and strategic desperation that had forged it. Thus, the Betty's reign was established. It was a symbol of Japanese technological ambition and operational reach, a machine that had reshaped naval warfare in a single day. It represented the peak of Japan's initial offensive prowess, a tool that allowed a resource-poor nation to project power across an ocean. But its dominance was built on a precarious foundation. The very feature that made it so effective, its phenomenal range, achieved through a lightweight design and massive internal fuel capacity, was also its Achilles heel. The legend of the Betty was born in the sinking of mighty battleships, but its fate would be sealed in the fiery, brutal combats over the Solomon Islands, where its secret would be laid bare for Allied engineers to study and for its own crews to die by. For Allied intelligence, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber was a frustrating enigma. They understood its capabilities from devastating experience, its long reach, its substantial bomb load, its surprising speed. They had witnessed its terrifying propensity to explode when hit. But the why remained elusive. Intelligence reports, aerial photographs, and a shattered wreckage of downed aircraft could only tell part of the story. To truly understand the Betty, to dissect its strengths and exploit its fatal weaknesses, Allied intelligence needed a prize of incalculable value, a fully intact, flyable, or at least largely complete specimen. This was no easy task. Japanese pilots, bound by Bushido code, often fought to the death or deliberately crashed their aircraft to prevent capture. Finding a Betty that was both salvageable and accessible was a challenge that would require a combination of sheer luck, meticulous planning, and the chaotic fortunes of war. The opportunity finally presented itself in the sprawling, chaotic theater of the South Pacific, most likely in the latter half of 1942 or early 1943. The setting would have been one of the many advanced airfields seized or built by the Japanese in their rapid expansion. A place like Rabaul in New Britain, Lan, New Guinea, or even one of the hard-fought strips on Guadalcanal itself. The scenario for its capture typically followed one of two paths. The first was a forced landing. A Betty, heavily damaged by anti-aircraft fire or pursuing Allied fighters, its engines failing or its controls shot up, would be forced to make a desperate emergency landing on a friendly airfield. However, in the confusion of a retreat or a sudden Allied advance, the airfield would be overrun before the precious bomber could be repaired, moved, or destroyed. The ground crew, often consisting of mechanics rather than combat troops, will be forced to flee or surrender, leaving the disabled but structurally intact aircraft behind. The second, more dramatic scenario was a direct capture during a ground assault. As Allied forces, primarily the Americans and Australians, began their island-hopping counteroffensive, they would often overwhelm Japanese positions with surprising speed. A raid on a Japanese airbase might find Bettys lined up on the runway, fully fueled and armed for a mission that would now never come. In the frantic fighting, some of these aircraft would be destroyed in the crossfire or by demolition charges laid by retreating Japanese engineers. But occasionally, the speed of the assault would be so great that one or more aircraft would be seized before they could be sabotaged. The sight of a pristine, or nearly pristine, Betty bomber sitting silently on a captured runway was a moment of immense excitement and urgency for the advancing Allied troops. The immediate reaction upon securing such a prize was a race against time. The Allied command knew the Japanese would quickly learn of the capture and would do everything in their power to destroy the aircraft. The airfield would become a prime target for Japanese artillery, naval bombardment, or kamikaze attacks. The first order of business was to secure a perimeter and deploy anti-aircraft guns for its protection. Simultaneously, a team of technical intelligence specialists, often from the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit, ATIU, operating in the Pacific, would be dispatched to the site. These were not just soldiers. They were engineers, linguists, and aircraft specialists whose mission was to extract every possible secret from the enemy's machinery. The initial inspection was a revelation. For the first time, Allied experts could walk around, touch, and climb inside the legendary bomber. The first thing that struck them was its size. The Betty was a large aircraft, its sleek fuselage dominating the captured airfield. They would carefully document everything: the placement of its armament, the layout of its cockpit, the types of radios and navigation equipment, and the all-important engine types. Every manual, every maintenance log, every scrap of paper found in the cockpit or nearby workshops was seized, bagged, and tagged for translation. They would note the construction techniques, the quality of the materials, and the overall workmanship. This alone provided a treasure trove of tactical data, revealing performance ceilings, optimal cruise speeds, and potential mechanical vulnerabilities. But the real prize, the core of the mystery, lay in its fuel system. The engineers would have immediately begun tracing the fuel lines from the engines back to the tanks. They would have looked for the self-sealing technology that was standard on American and British aircraft, a layered rubber lining that would swell and plug holes when soaked in fuel. Their meticulous examination would have found none. Instead, they would have discovered vast, thin-skinned fuel tanks integrated directly into the wing structure, with minimal protective shielding. They might have even conducted on-the-spot tests, carefully draining the tanks and probing the material to confirm its vulnerability. Once the initial intelligence was gathered, the monumental task of moving the bomber began. If it was in a flyable condition, the most daring option was to find a pilot with the courage to fly it. A captured Japanese pilot might be coerced, or an Allied test pilot, after a crash course in Japanese cockpit layouts, might attempt the incredibly risky feat of flying a hostile aircraft of unknown airworthiness out of a combat zone. More often, if the aircraft was not flyable, it would be carefully disassembled. Its wings would be removed, its fuselage loaded onto a ship or a heavy transport barge under the cover of darkness and fighter patrols. This vulnerable convoy would then run the gauntlet of Japanese submarines and aircraft to a secure location, such as a major base in Australia or even the United States itself. The capture of an intact Betty bomber was a pivotal intelligence coup. It transformed the aircraft from a spectral threat into a tangible machine whose secrets could be laid bare on an engineer's workbench. The stage was now set for the most detailed autopsy imaginable, one that would not only explain the flying lighter's tragic flaw, but would also reveal the profound and ultimately fatal design philosophy of the entire Japanese war machine. The journey of the captured Betty bomber culminated not on a war-torn Pacific airstrip, but within the sterile, clinical environment of a stateside Allied technical intelligence center, most likely at Wright Field in Ohio or a similar stateside facility. Here, far from the threat of enemy attack, the aircraft was no longer a weapon of war, but a specimen, a complex puzzle to be disassembled and understood down to its last rivet. This was not a simple inspection. It was a full forensic autopsy, conducted by teams of America's best aeronautical engineers, metallurgists, and armament specialists. Their mission was systematic and ruthless: to deconstruct the myth of the Betty, to quantify every strength, and, most importantly, to pinpoint every weakness with scientific precision. The process would reveal not just engineering choices, but a national philosophy laid bare in aluminum and steel. The autopsy began with the aircraft's fundamental structure. Engineers meticulously measured and weighed every component, their initial notes reflecting a sense of professional admiration mixed with disbelief. The Betty's airframe was a masterpiece of lightweight construction. Its monocoque fuselage was remarkably light and sleek, a key contributor to its impressive speed and range. The wings were long and elegant, designed for aerodynamic efficiency at high altitudes. However, this admiration quickly turned to shock as they assessed the structural integrity. The skin of the aircraft was alarmingly thin, far more so than comparable American bombers like the B-25 Mitchell or the B-26 Marauder. There was a conspicuous absence of protective armor plate in critical areas. The pilot's seat, the navigator's station, the radio operator's position. None were shielded by the thick steel plates that American crews relied on to deflect cannon shells and bullets. This discovery alone was staggering. It meant the Betty's crew were essentially exposed, their survival dependent solely on the enemy's poor aim. Next, the teams turned their attention to the armament. They carefully studied the placement and operation of the 20 mm tail cannon and the 7.7 mm machine guns. While the weapons themselves were competent, the engineers noted significant limitations in their fields of fire. The defensive positions were not power-operated turrets like those on a B-17 Flying Fortress, but manually operated stations with limited traverse. This meant that a determined attacker, diving from certain angles, could approach the bomber with relative impunity. The reports would later emphasize this tactical vulnerability. To defeat the Betty, Allied pilots needed to avoid the deadly tail cannon and exploit the weaker dorsal and beam attacks, with a manual machine gun struggled to track a fast-moving target. But it was the investigation into the fuel system that confirmed the Allies' most crucial battlefield observations and unlocked the central mystery of the flying lighter. The process was methodical. Engineers first traced the complex web of fuel lines from the two Mitsubishi G4M engines back through the wings. They immediately confirmed the absence of any self-sealing technology. In American and British aircraft, fuel tanks were lined with multiple layers of vulcanized rubber. When a bullet punctured the tank, the fuel would cause the rubber to swell, sealing the hole and dramatically reducing the risk of a catastrophic fire. The Betty's tanks were simple, lightweight aluminum containers. A puncture meant a steady, vaporizing stream of high-octane aviation fuel. The true revelation, however, was the scale and integration of these tanks. The Betty's most defining external feature, its large, cylindrical fuselage, was not just a fuselage. It was a massive, integral fuel tank. The wings, too, were not simply structures that held fuel tanks. They were designed as wet wings, where the entire leading-edge section of the wing itself formed the walls of the fuel container. This design maximized fuel capacity to achieve the coveted range, but it did so by turning the entire aircraft into a flying tinderbox. There were no self-sealing bladders, no inert gas systems to fill empty space in the tanks with non-flammable gas, and only the most minimal, if any, armor protection around these vast fuel reservoirs. The engineers conducted tests, likely on salvaged wing sections or replicated tank materials. They fired .50 caliber rounds into the thin aluminum skin. The results were predictable and horrifying. The rounds tore through the metal, creating clean entry and exit wounds that poured forth fuel. When ignited, the entire structure was almost instantly engulfed in a fireball. The vulnerability was not a minor flaw. It was a fundamental, baked-in characteristic of the design. The Allied pilots' grim observations were now irrefutable scientific fact. The Betty's legendary range was purchased at the direct cost of crew survivability and combat resilience. The final stage of the autopsy was a comparative analysis. The intelligence teams produced detailed reports contrasting the Betty with its Allied counterparts. They created charts showing the stark trade-off. The Betty could fly farther and faster than a B-25, but it sacrificed every ounce of protective armor and self-sealing technology to do so. The American design philosophy was one of resilience and crew protection, resulting in heavier, shorter-range aircraft that could absorb tremendous punishment and still return home. The Japanese philosophy, as evidenced by the Betty, was one of offensive reach and performance, treating the aircraft and its crew as somewhat expendable in the pursuit of a single, decisive mission. The report that landed on the desks of military planners and squadron commanders was a game-changer. It provided a confirmed, technical blueprint for defeating the Betty. The findings were distilled into clear, tactical directives for Allied pilots. Aim for the wing routes. Use incendiary ammunition. Your .50 caliber rounds are more than sufficient to ignite the fuel vapors. Avoid the tail cannon, but from any other angle, a few solid hits will be fatal. The enigmatic flying lighter was a mystery no more. It had been measured, weighed, and understood. Its great strength was its profound weakness, and American engineers had just provided every Allied pilot in the Pacific with the knowledge to exploit it. The American engineers' autopsy of the captured Betty bomber revealed a truth far more profound than a simple design flaw. The absence of self-sealing fuel tanks and protective armor was not an oversight or a technological failure. It was the deliberate, calculated core of a distinct and ruthless military philosophy. This was the Japanese doctrine of Kodo, the way of the emperor or imperial way, as applied to machinery, a philosophy that prioritized offensive spirit, strategic range, and raw performance above all else, including the survival of the men who crewed the weapons. To understand the Betty is to understand a worldview where the machine was an extension of the warrior's soul, and where sacrifice was not an unfortunate byproduct of war, but a fundamental tenet of its execution. At the heart of this philosophy lay an uncompromising emphasis on range. The Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, tasked with dominating the world's largest ocean, issued specifications for a land-based attack bomber that could operate across the vast, empty expanses of the Pacific. The strategic problem was simple. Japan lacked a network of secure, advanced airbases from which to project power. The solution was to build an aircraft that was, in itself, a mobile airbase. The Mitsubishi design team was given an almost impossible mandate: create a bomber with a range exceeding 3,000 nautical miles. In an era before in-flight refueling, this range had to be achieved through sheer fuel capacity and aerodynamic efficiency. Every pound counted. The calculus became brutal. The weight of self-sealing liner for the fuel tanks, or the armor plate to protect the crew and engines, was weight that could not be devoted to fuel. To meet the range requirement, these features were deemed expendable. The aircraft's primary mission was to reach the target and strike it. Returning was a secondary consideration. This design choice was inextricably linked to the Japanese military's conceptualization of the pilot and crew. The ethos of Bushido, the way of the warrior, permeated the armed forces. The ultimate sacrifice for the emperor was not just expected, it was glorified. In this cultural context, a bomber crew was not seen as a highly trained, technically skilled asset to be preserved and rotated home, as in the American system. They were samurai of the sky. Designing an aircraft with heavy armor could be interpreted as a lack of faith in the crew's skill and offensive spirit, a suggestion that they needed to be coddled. The Betty was built for the attack, not for the defense. Its defensive armament was sufficient to fend off fighters, but its real defense was its speed and the determination of its crew. The concept of a flying fortress that could wade through enemy fire was alien to this mindset. The Betty was a swift, long-reaching katana, not a shielded knight. The technological and industrial realities of Japan further cemented this path. Japan was a resource-poor nation. Rubber for self-sealing liners was a strategic material in critically short supply, desperately needed for tires and other essential military equipment. High-quality steel for armor plating was likewise reserved for warships and tanks. The lightweight aluminum used in the Betty's construction was a precious commodity. The designers were working within severe material constraints, forcing them to make agonizing trade-offs. The choice was not between a safe Betty and a vulnerable Betty. The choice was between a long-range, lightweight Betty and no Betty at all. Given the strategic imperative of reaching the enemy across the Pacific, the decision was clear. The industrial base simply could not support the mass production of a heavily armored, self-sealing bomber with the same phenomenal range. This philosophy manifested in the Betty's most infamous characteristic, its propensity to ignite. The American tests confirmed what combat had already shown. A few .50 caliber rounds into the wing could turn the aircraft into an inferno. The unprotected aluminum fuel tanks, integral to the wing structure, would rupture and leak highly volatile aviation fuel. The fumes would fill the wing cavities, and any spark from electrical wires, hot engine manifolds, or incendiary rounds would trigger a catastrophic explosion. Unlike an American B-17, which could often survive dozens of hits, absorb punishment, and limp back to base with wounded crew and feathered engines, the Betty had no such resilience. It was a binary machine. Either it completed its mission unscathed, or it was destroyed. There was very little middle ground. The philosophy of speed and range over protection created a devastatingly effective weapon in the opening phase of the war. The Betty's ability to appear suddenly and strike decisively, as it did against the Prince of Wales and Repulse, was a product of this very design. However, as the war progressed and the Allies recovered from the initial shock, the doctrine's fatal weakness was exposed. American pilots, armed with the knowledge from intelligence reports and flying more rugged, well-protected aircraft like the Hellcat and Corsair, learned to exploit the Betty's vulnerability mercilessly. The flying lighter became a death trap for its highly trained, but tragically exposed, crews. The same philosophy that granted it unparalleled strategic reach also made it horrifyingly vulnerable in a sustained tactical fight, a stark demonstration that in the brutal arithmetic of total war, a doctrine built on sacrifice could, in the end, sacrifice the war itself. The clinical analysis of stateside engineers and the tactical briefings for Allied pilots could not capture the full, grim reality of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty in combat. For the men who had to fly it, the bomber was known by a different, more visceral name, the Type 1 lighter, Yifrada Ichishikiraida, or more darkly, the Flying Coffin, Feishing Genkan, Hiko Kanok. These are not nicknames given by their enemies, but by the Japanese aircrews themselves. They were a stark, unofficial admission of the terrifying truth they lived with on every mission. They were strapped into a machine whose design philosophy fundamentally valued the mission over their lives. The Betty was the physical embodiment of a military doctrine that saw its personnel as expendable components in the grand strategy of the empire, a doctrine that would ultimately incinerate a generation of Japan's finest naval aviators. The crew's intimate knowledge of their aircraft's vulnerability created a psychological burden unique in aerial warfare. Every pilot, every navigator, every gunner knew that there was no margin for error, no protective shell to give them a fighting chance. A single hit in the wrong place, a place that on an American bomber might mean a manageable fuel leak or a wounded crewman, meant an instantaneous, fiery death. They could feel the fragility of their aircraft, the thin skin of the fuselage, the lack of armor at their backs, the ominous gurgle of thousands of liters of fuel in the wings surrounding them. This knowledge bred a particular kind of courage, one tinged with fatalism. Missions were often flown with the unspoken understanding that they were one way. The relentless Allied interception, particularly after the technical weaknesses of the Betty were systematically exploited, turned sorties into suicide missions in all but name long before the formal kamikaze tactic was adopted. The contrast with their American counterparts could not have been more pronounced. A B-17 Flying Fortress, while certainly vulnerable to concentrated fighter attack and flak, was designed for resilience. It had self-sealing fuel tanks, extensive armor plating around the crew positions, and redundant control systems. American bomber crews operated on the principle that their aircraft could absorb tremendous punishment and still bring them home. This created a culture of endurance and survival. The Japanese bomber crew, by contrast, operated on the principle of the decisive blow. Their survival was secondary to the successful delivery of their ordnance. This was the ultimate expression of Kodo and Bushido, the complete subordination of the individual to the mission and the state. The aircraft was not a vessel to bring them home. It was a guided missile with a human guidance system. This doctrine of sacrifice manifested with horrifying clarity in the Betty's role in one of the most infamous incidents of the Pacific War, the assassination of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters, acting on decrypted intelligence, ambushed the Betty transporting the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. The interception was a perfect demonstration of the bomber's fatal flaws. The attacking P-38s, armed with a mix of .50 caliber and 20 mm cannon fire, focused their attack on the lead Betty carrying the Admiral. The 20 mm cannon shells, in particular, tore through the unarmored airframe and ruptured the unprotected fuel tanks. The bomber, engulfed in flames, crashed into the jungle of Bougainville Island, killing all on board. The same characteristics that had made the Betty a potent strategic weapon, its speed and range, were irrelevant in the face of a well-executed interception that targeted its fundamental lack of defensive survivability. The most important passenger in the Japanese Empire had been flying in a flying coffin, and the design philosophy that built it had delivered him to his death. As the war progressed, and American air superiority became overwhelming, the Betty's mortality rate reached apocalyptic levels. Veteran crews, whose skills were irreplaceable, were burned out of the sky with terrifying efficiency. The loss of these experienced men, the navigators who could find a tiny atoll in a vast ocean, the pilots who could handle the demanding aircraft in bad weather, the gunners who knew how to lead a target, created a crippling brain drain. They were replaced by younger, less trained crews, whose effectiveness was lower and whose chances of survival were even more diminished. This created a vicious cycle of decline. The aircraft, never forgiving to begin with, became even deadlier in the hands of inexperienced crews facing battle-hardened American fighter pilots. The term pilot's coffin was thus not an exaggeration, but a technical and moral assessment. The Betty bomber was a machine that consumed its own. It was the product of a culture that could conceive of a warrior's glorious death, but failed to engineer a warrior's life. The courage of the men who flew, it was undeniable, but their sacrifice was often wasted by a doctrine that prized the symbolic act of attack over the practical necessity of sustained combat power. They were not simply killed by American bullets. They were killed by a design blueprint that saw them as expendable, by an industrial base that could not protect them, and by a military strategy that sent them on missions in a machine that offered no quarter and no second chance. The charred wreckage of countless Bettys scattered across the jungles and coral atolls of the Pacific stands as a somber monument to this fatal doctrine, a testament to the thousands of airmen who were, quite literally, entombed in the very weapon they were ordered to wield. The Mitsubishi G4M Betty was more than an aircraft. It was a metallic metaphor for the Imperial Japanese war effort. Its sleek, formidable exterior and its devastating initial reach perfectly mirrored the stunning, rapid conquests of 1941 to 42. And just as the Empire's early victories gave way to a protracted, grinding war of attrition it could not win, the Betty's fatal vulnerabilities, its unprotected fuel tanks and lack of armor, became emblematic of Japan's fundamental strategic weaknesses: a brittle industrial base, a doctrine of decisive battle over sustained resilience, and a tragic disregard for the preservation of its own most valuable assets. The story of the Betty is the story of Japan's war in microcosm, a stark tale of initial brilliance undone by fatal overreach and a profound philosophical clash with its American adversary. The Allied and Japanese military doctrines represented two diametrically opposed views of warfare, and their bombers were the purest expression of this divergence. The American philosophy, born of a vast industrial base and a culture that valued individual life, was one of mass production and survivability. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not just a name, it was a design specification. It was built to take punishment and bring its crew home. It was heavy, laden with armor, equipped with self-sealing tanks, and armed with powered turrets to create a formidable defensive sphere. The American strategy was one of attrition, to field a massive, resilient force that could absorb losses and grind the enemy down through overwhelming, sustained material power. The crew was a highly trained, expensively schooled asset to be protected and recycled through multiple missions. Japan's doctrine, by contrast, was one of qualitative superiority and a single, decisive blow. The Betty was the apotheosis of this concept. It was designed for the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle, where a qualitatively superior force would deliver one overwhelming strike to shatter the enemy's will and fleet. Every aspect of the Betty was optimized for this moment. Its range to reach the enemy, its speed to avoid interception, its payload to inflict maximum damage. In this philosophy, the aircraft was a one-use weapon, and the crew were the samurai who wielded it. Their survival was secondary to the success of the mission. Protection was sacrificed for performance. Resilience was traded for range. This doctrine worked perfectly against unprepared enemies in the war's opening act, just as the Betty had triumphed against the Prince of Wales and Repulse. But it contained the seeds of its own destruction, for it had no answer for an enemy that refused to be decisively beaten in a single engagement. This clash of doctrines played out with brutal clarity in the skies over the Solomon Islands during the grueling campaign for Guadalcanal in 1942-43. Here, the Betty's role shifted from a long-range naval striker to a tactical transport and bomber in a contested airspace. It was a role for which it was catastrophically ill-suited. Flying from bases at Rabaul to resupply Japanese troops on the island or to attack the American fleet off Lunga Point, the Bettys had to run a gauntlet of U.S. Marine and Navy fighters like the F-4F Wildcat and, later, the F-4U Corsair. The results were slaughter. American pilots, learning quickly, discovered that a short burst of .50 caliber fire into the Betty's wings would almost guarantee a fiery kill. The flying lighter lived up to its name, and the waters north of Guadalcanal became known as Iron Bottom Sound, in part due to the countless Japanese aircraft, including dozens of Bettys, sent to the depths. The loss rates were unsustainable. An entire generation of Japan's elite naval aviation crews, the men who had trained for a decade and executed the complex attacks at Pearl Harbor and elsewhere, was being incinerated in the cockpits of their flawed bombers. This was not just a loss of aircraft. It was a catastrophic erosion of human capital. Japan's training pipeline could not replace these veterans, leading to a rapid decline in the skill and effectiveness of new aircrews. Meanwhile, the United States was ramping up its own training programs, producing thousands of new pilots and deploying ever greater numbers of more advanced, more survivable aircraft. The Betty, and the doctrine it represented, was losing a war of attrition it was never designed to fight. The ultimate symbol of this doctrinal failure was the Betty's adaptation into the transport for the Jiretsu, heroic special forces, and, most infamously, its selection as the carrier for the Oka, cherry blossom, rocket-powered human-guided bomb, the ultimate flying coffin. The Oka, dropped from a modified Betty mothership, was a pure expression of the sacrifice doctrine, a piloted, explosive projectile designed for a one-way mission. The Bettys carrying these weapons were themselves rendered even more vulnerable, weighed down and sluggish, making them easy prey for American fighters before they could even launch their deadly cargo. This evolution from a sophisticated bomber to a delivery system for suicide weapons marked the final bankruptcy of the original doctrine. Quality and skill had been replaced by desperation and sacrifice. In the end, the Betty bomber embodied the tragic arc of Japan's war. It was a brilliant, specialized instrument for a specific kind of conflict, a short, sharp war of expansion. But when faced with the industrial might and philosophical resilience of the United States, its specialized excellence became a fatal specialty. The unprotected fuel tanks that allowed it to strike at Pearl Harbor were the same tanks that turned it into a funeral pyre over Guadalcanal. The clash was not just between .50 caliber bullets and thin aluminum. It was a clash between a doctrine of the decisive battle and a doctrine of sustained mobilization, between a culture that glorified sacrifice and one that engineered survival. The Betty story is the story of how a war that began with a shocking, long-range victory ended with the charred wreckage of its best weapons and the annihilation of its most skilled warriors, a testament to the fact that no amount of courage can compensate for a flawed and brittle strategic doctrine.